In the early days of World War II, during the rapid German advance through France, one moment stood out as almost impossible. A single British tank, isolated and outnumbered, managed to slow down an entire German division. This was not part of a larger plan, and it was not supported by reinforcements. It happened because one crew refused to retreat. As German forces pushed forward with speed and coordination, most resistance was quickly overwhelmed. But in one small village, the advance suddenly stalled. Roads were blocked, units were delayed, and confusion spread through the German ranks. And at the center of it all was one heavily armored vehicle that refused to move. Before we break down exactly how this happened, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Confidential for more real World War II stories told with accuracy and clarity. No fiction, no exaggeration, only what actually happened. Because this was not a large-scale battle or a coordinated defense, it was a single moment where determination, positioning, and timing disrupted one of the most powerful military advances in history. The tank was a British Matilda II, known for its heavy armor, at a time when most German anti-tank weapons struggled to penetrate it. And inside that tank was a crew led by Lieutenant Richard Anand, a man who understood that retreat was not always the only option. The situation unfolded near the village of Hanut in Belgium, where British and French forces were attempting to slow the German advance. German units, supported by tanks and infantry, moved quickly through the region, expecting only light resistance. Their strategy relied on speed. Break through, move forward, and avoid getting tied down. But when this single Matilda tank took position, that momentum was suddenly challenged. German anti-tank guns opened fire, expecting a quick result. Instead, their shells failed to penetrate the armor. The tank kept moving, advancing directly into positions that should have stopped it. What followed was not a typical engagement. The Matilda moved through the battlefield with a level of confidence that the Germans did not expect. It engaged multiple targets, forcing German units to reposition and respond. Each time they tried to stop it, the tank held its ground or pushed forward again. From the German perspective, this created a problem far larger than the tank itself. It disrupted movement, delayed coordination, and forced units to focus on a single threat instead of continuing their advance. And in a war where speed was everything, even a short delay could have serious consequences. But at this stage, the Germans still believed they could stop it. They just needed the right moment. As the engagement continued, German forces began to realize that this was not a standard target. Their anti-tank guns, which were effective against most Allied vehicles, struggled to penetrate the Matilda's armor. Shell after shell struck the tank, but instead of being destroyed, it kept moving. This forced German units to change their approach. Instead of continuing their advance, they were now focused on stopping a single vehicle that refused to go down. Orders shifted, guns were repositioned, and more firepower was directed toward the tank. But every moment spent dealing with it was a moment lost in their larger operation. Inside the tank, the situation was just as intense. The crew could hear every impact, feel the force of each hit, and knew they were completely exposed. There was no backup, no support, and no guarantee they would survive the next minute. But instead of pulling back, they continued forward, targeting German positions that posed the greatest threat. Machine gun nests, anti-tank crews, and infantry units were engaged one by one. The goal was not to destroy the entire enemy force, but to create disruption, and it worked. German units were forced to spread out, take cover, and react instead of advancing. The presence of the Matilda created uncertainty across the battlefield. Reports began circulating that British armor was still active in the area, even though most units had already withdrawn. German commanders could not ignore the threat. They needed to neutralize it before continuing forward. This hesitation slowed their progress and disrupted their timing. In a campaign built on speed and coordination, even a small delay could have a ripple effect across multiple units. And for a brief moment, that is exactly what this single tank achieved. Eventually, heavier weapons were brought into position. German forces began preparing to use artillery and more powerful guns that had a better chance of penetrating the Matilda's armor. The situation was changing. What had started as an unexpected obstacle was now being treated as a priority target. The pressure on the crew increased with every passing minute. They had already done more than anyone expected, but the longer they stayed, the more dangerous the situation became. And now, the Germans were ready to respond with the full force needed to stop them. As heavier German weapons were brought into position, the balance of the fight began to shift. The Matilda had held off repeated attacks, but now it was facing firepower specifically chosen to destroy it. Anti-tank guns with higher caliber rounds were deployed, and artillery began targeting its position. The open terrain that had allowed the tank to move freely now worked against it. Each movement risked exposure, and each hit carried more force than before. The impacts grew stronger, louder, more dangerous. The advantage of armor was still there, but it was no longer absolute. Inside the tank, conditions were deteriorating. The crew had been operating under constant fire, with limited visibility, and no clear idea of how long they could continue. Communication with other units was gone. They were alone, relying only on what they could see through narrow viewing ports. Every decision had to be immediate. Stay and fight, or attempt to withdraw under fire. But withdrawal was not simple. The surrounding German forces had tightened their positions, anticipating movement. Any attempt to pull back would expose the tank to direct fire from multiple angles. Despite this, the crew continued to engage. They targeted the most immediate threats, focusing on gun positions that could penetrate their armor. Each successful shot bought them a few more seconds. Each movement forced the enemy to adjust again. The battlefield remained unstable, shaped by the presence of a single vehicle that refused to stop. German units could not ignore it, and they could not easily destroy it. The delay continued, even as the pressure increased, but this moment could not last forever. The German response was becoming more coordinated. Artillery fire began to land closer, forcing the tank into tighter movement patterns. More guns were brought in, covering escape routes and limiting options. The Matilda had already done something extraordinary, but now it was facing a level of resistance that even its armor could not withstand indefinitely. The fight was reaching its limit, and the next few moments would decide whether the crew could escape or be stopped where they stood. The final phase of the engagement came suddenly. After enduring repeated attacks, the Matilda was eventually hit by a round powerful enough to break through its armor. The impact disabled the tank, bringing its movement to a stop. For the first time since the encounter began, the German forces had achieved what they had been trying to do from the start. The single vehicle that had delayed their advance was no longer a mobile threat. But even then, the situation was not immediately resolved. The crew was still inside, and German units approached cautiously, aware of what this tank had already done. With the tank immobilized, the crew had only limited options left. Staying inside meant being trapped, attempting to escape meant exposure. Under continued pressure, they were eventually forced to abandon the vehicle. German soldiers moved in, securing the area and confirming that the threat had been neutralized. The engagement was over. The Matilda, which had held off an entire formation for far longer than expected, was now silent on the battlefield. But the time it had bought could not be undone. For the German forces, this was more than just the destruction of a single tank. It was a disruption they had not planned for. Their advance, built on speed and coordination, had been delayed by something that should not have been able to stop them. Units had been pulled out of position, attention had been diverted, and momentum had been slowed. Even a short interruption in such a fast-moving campaign had consequences. The delay affected timing, coordination, and the flow of operations in that sector. For the British side, the outcome was clear. One tank had managed to achieve what larger forces sometimes could not. It had forced the enemy to stop, react, and commit resources. It had created time, and in a situation where time was critical, that alone had value. The crew had operated under constant pressure, without support, and against overwhelming numbers. What they achieved was not measured in territory gained, but in the impact they had on the enemy's advance. And that impact would define how this moment was remembered. In the aftermath, the story of the single Matilda tank quickly spread, not because it changed the outcome of the campaign, but because of what it represented. At a time when German forces were advancing rapidly across Western Europe, most resistance was quickly overwhelmed. But this moment showed something different. It showed that even within a larger retreat, isolated actions could still have an impact. The delay caused by one tank did not stop the German advance entirely, but it disrupted it enough to matter in that moment, and in a campaign defined by speed, even small interruptions carried weight. For military observers, the encounter highlighted both strengths and weaknesses on both sides. The Matilda's armor had proven highly effective against standard German anti-tank weapons, confirming that protection could be just as important as firepower. At the same time, the German response demonstrated how quickly an experienced force could adapt. Once heavier weapons were brought in and coordination improved, the outcome shifted. This was not just a story of resistance, but also a reminder that no advantage lasts forever on the battlefield. Adaptation decides survival. For the crew, the experience was immediate and personal. They had faced a situation where survival was uncertain from the start. Every decision carried risk, and every moment under fire pushed the limits of what was possible. They operated without support, relying entirely on their training and judgment. And while the tank was eventually lost, their actions had already achieved something significant. They had forced a much larger force to stop, react, and commit resources to a single threat. That alone changed the dynamic of the situation, even if only temporarily. In the broader context of World War II, this moment stands as an example of how individual actions can influence larger events. It was not a turning point in the war, but it was a clear demonstration of how determination, positioning, and timing can disrupt even the most powerful advances. The story of one tank holding back an entire division is not about exaggeration. It is about understanding how, in the right moment, a single decision can create consequences far beyond its size.